The door at Kensington Palace closed on Prince Harry tonight, and it was not staff who turned the lock, it was his own brother, who had already signed the internal directive hours before the request ever arrived. William did not refuse Harry because of anger. He refused him because of arithmetic, the cold arithmetic of a future monarch who has finally calculated the exact cost of forgiveness and decided the crown cannot afford it. What was framed publicly as a routine communication had, in truth, been a private plea, delivered through a trusted intermediary, carrying a single sentence Harry had been rehearsing for weeks. That sentence never reached the drawing room. It was intercepted at the threshold of a decision already made, by a man who had learned, at last, to treat sentiment as a security risk. Behind that closed door, a folder had been placed on a mahogany table, its label neutral, its contents final. And in that folder lived the quiet architecture of a rejection that would echo far beyond one family. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room in which the decision was ratified was smaller than most would imagine. Not a state chamber, not a gilded hall, but a working office lined with pale gray walls, a single narrow window, and a desk polished so many times its grain had begun to shine like old glass. On that desk sat three objects: a leather-bound diary, closed, a cream-colored envelope, unopened, and a slim black folder marked only with a date. The door was shut. The corridor outside had been cleared. No cameras, no statements, no warnings. William stood beside the window, hands behind his back, watching the light changed across the garden, the way a man watches a tide he can no longer stop. That mattered because in royal households, a closed door is never simply a closed door. It is a boundary drawn in ink that dries into policy. And on that afternoon, the ink had already dried. The envelope contained Harry's message. The folder contained the answer. The diary, closed and unread, contained the birthdays and anniversaries William had once promised himself he would never let slip. He did not open any of them. He did not need to. The decision had been made in the pause between two breaths, and the pause had lasted longer than the plea. For William, the moment was not anger. It was fatigue that had crystallized into structure. He had spent years absorbing headlines the way a seawall absorbs storms, and something inside him had quietly hardened into masonry. For Catherine, watching from a separate wing of the residence, it was sorrow disguised as composure, a sorrow that made her fold and refold the same linen napkin at the tea tray until the fabric began to memorize her hands. For Charles, receiving the update through a discreet aide, it was the ache of a father who had learned that a crown cannot bandage a household. And for Harry, waiting in a room 3,000 miles away, it was the slow, seasick realization that the door he had been knocking on had been welded shut long before his knuckles ever touched the wood. That mattered because each of them was living the same event through a different private grammar. One saw arithmetic, one saw grief, one saw duty, one saw exile, and none of them could speak the other's language anymore. The plea itself had been careful. Harry had not asked for restoration of titles, nor for the return of security details, nor for the reversal of any public rebuke. He had asked for something smaller, and therefore, in the strange calculus of royal life, something far more dangerous. He had asked to come home, not to the palace as an institution, but to the family as a memory. He had asked for a private dinner, without press, without protocol, without an agenda. In a documented private account circulated among a handful of senior aides, the request was described in 3 words that would later be underlined twice in a briefing note. Just one evening. That mattered because in the vocabulary of monarchy, the personal is never personal. A dinner is a signal is a precedent is a policy. And a policy, once set, cannot be revoked without cost. William understood this the way a chess player understands that the smallest pawn can collapse an entire defense. And so the smallest request became the largest refusal. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to a night nearly 2 years earlier, in a private dining room at Windsor, when the brothers had sat across from one another for the last time as anything resembling equals. The table had been set for 4. Only 2 chairs were used. A decanter of red wine sat between them untouched. According to a recorded internal note preserved by a household steward, The conversation lasted 47 minutes, and only 9 of those minutes contained spoken words. The rest was silence, cutlery, breathing, and the low mechanical hum of a clock that had been in the family since the reign of a queen neither of them had met. William had spoken first. He had said, in a voice stripped of all decoration, that trust was not a feeling, it was a ledger, and the ledger had been closed. Harry had answered that ledgers could be reopened. William had answered that some ledgers were sealed by the person whose signature was missing. That mattered because in that single exchange, the entire future of their relationship had been drafted, notarized, and quietly filed. Neither brother had known it at the time, but the folder on the mahogany desk, 2 years later, was simply the fair copy of a document written that night in silence. The confrontation that followed the plea did not happen in person. It happened through a single phone call, placed on a secure line, lasting 11 minutes. William did not raise his voice. Harry did not raise his. There were no accusations, no rehearsed speeches, no invocations of childhood. There was only a long, dry, cinematic silence between sentences, the kind of silence that in royal households is not absence but presence. A third figure in the room made of everything neither man could say. William asked one question. He asked whether Harry understood what returning would require. Harry answered that he did. William asked a second question. He asked whether Harry understood what returning would cost the institution. Harry did not answer. That silence in the ledger of the crown was interpreted as an admission. An admission, in simple terms, is the moment a party stops defending a position and quietly concedes the terrain. William did not press further. He did not need to. He said only that the door would remain as it was and that he was sorry. Then he ended the call. The phone was placed back in its cradle with the same care one uses when returning a relic to a glass case. The relic, in this case, was a brotherhood. Within the hour, the machinery began to move. A schedule was revised, a guest list was quietly amended. A card that had once borne Harry's name at an upcoming family event was removed from a silver tray in a corridor most of the public will never see. That card mattered because in royal households, a card is not paper. It is proof of belonging. Its removal is not clerical. It is constitutional. A senior aide walked the card down a hallway, past 3 portraits of former sovereigns, and placed it inside a drawer labeled with a single word: pending. Pending, in the language of the palace, is a category that almost never resolves. It is the drawer where reconciliations go to age. Elsewhere in the building, a small wooden box was retrieved from a storage room and carried, without ceremony, to an office on the 2nd floor. Inside the box were items William had once kept as reminders of a shared boyhood: a cricket ball, a folded map of a summer estate, a photograph of 2 boys in matching coats, standing beside a woman whose smile had outlived her. The box was not thrown away. It was simply moved. That mattered because in the emotional geometry of the palace, moving is not the same as discarding. Moving is the polite fiction of preservation. It is the way institutions grieve without admitting they are grieving. Then came the second jolt, the one that transformed a private refusal into an irreversible position. A briefing document, no more than 2 pages long, was circulated to a narrow ring of senior figures within the household. The document did not mention Harry by name. It did not need to. It outlined in the flat, unemotional prose of institutional writing a revised protocol for future family communications, one that would route all such requests through a formal channel rather than a personal one. In plain language, this meant that Harry could no longer reach William directly. He would have to write to an office, and the office would decide whether the letter was ever placed on a desk. That mattered because in the intimate arithmetic of siblings, the loss of a direct line is not a bureaucratic adjustment. It is the moment a brother becomes a correspondent. And a correspondent, in the long history of the crown, is only one careful step away from becoming a stranger. Charles, informed of the new protocol in the quiet of his study, did not object. He did not endorse it either. He simply asked whether William was certain. The aide who delivered the update would later describe the king's expression as the expression of a man reading a weather report he had already lived through. Charles had spent his entire life watching families become institutions and institutions become monuments. and he understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that a monument cannot embrace. He placed the briefing document on his own desk, beside a small framed photograph of two young boys in matching coats. He did not look at the photograph. He did not need to. He knew every detail of it the way a sailor knows the shape of a coastline he has not seen in decades. That mattered because in that small, unspoken gesture, a father acknowledged that he had lost the authority to overrule his son, and that the crown, which he had once believed would grant him power, had in truth granted him only the responsibility of witnessing. Catherine, in her own way, had already begun the private work of absorption. She had spent the morning with the children, and she had not mentioned the matter to any of them. She had walked through the small garden behind the residence, pausing beside a row of white roses that had been planted in memory of a woman she had never met. She had touched one of the blooms, lightly, the way one touches a page in an old book. According to a family memorandum later preserved among household correspondence, she had said only one sentence to her private secretary that morning. She had said that some doors close so slowly that no one hears them shut. That mattered because in a household defined by ceremonial noise, the quietest observation is often the most accurate. Catherine had understood, before the folder was ever placed on the mahogany desk, that the refusal had already been written. She had simply been waiting to see who would sign it. Harry, in the hours after the call, did not speak publicly. He did not issue a statement. He did not authorize a briefing. He walked, instead, through the rooms of the home he had built far from the palace, and he stopped in front of a single photograph on a shelf. The photograph showed a boy of perhaps 10, standing beside an older brother, both of them squinting into a bright English sun. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not take it down. He did not turn it over. He simply looked, the way a man looks at a country he can no longer enter. That mattered because in that single unwitnessed moment, the entire meaning of the refusal was compressed into a single frame. Not a rejection of a request, a rejection of a return. Not a closed door, a closed chapter. And Harry, who had spent years insisting that the story could still be rewritten, understood at last that the pen had been taken from his hand and placed inside a drawer labeled pending. To understand why this refusal carried the weight it did, the story must return once more to a rehearsal room in a wing of Buckingham Palace on a gray morning nearly a decade earlier, when the brothers had stood together for a coordination briefing ahead of a state occasion. The room had smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee. A junior aide had been arranging chairs. William had turned to Harry, and, in a moment that was never recorded but has since been described in a documented private account, had said that whatever happened in the years to come, the two of them would always speak with one voice on matters of family. Harry had nodded. He had believed it. He had believed it the way younger brothers believe the promises of older ones, with a trust that requires no evidence because it is built from every shared childhood memory ever accumulated. That mattered because a decade later, in the small pale gray office with the polished desk, William did not break that promise out of malice. He broke it out of a slow, accumulated recognition that the voice they had once shared had been fractured beyond repair, and that continuing to pretend otherwise would cost the institution more than either of them could privately afford. The intimate two-person scene, when it finally came, was not between the brothers. It was between William and Catherine, in the quiet hour after the children had gone to bed, when the residents had settled into the particular hush that only old houses know. He had come into the sitting room without ceremony. He had sat down beside her. He had not spoken for several minutes. She had not asked him to. She had simply reached for his hand and held it, the way a wife holds the hand of a man who has just made a decision he will carry for the rest of his life. He had said at last that he had not wanted it to end this way. She had said that endings rarely honor the wishes of those who must sign them. He had said that he loved his brother. She had said that she knew. That mattered because in that small exchange, stripped of every title and every crown and every centuries-old expectation, two people had spoken as husband and wife, not as prince and princess, and they had told one another the truth. The truth was that love and duty are not opposites, but they are not always allies, and sometimes the price of the second is paid in the currency of the first. Outside the palace walls, the public had begun to sense that something had shifted, though no one could yet name it. A small crowd gathered near the gates by mid-afternoon, drawn by the instinct that draws people to the sea, before a storm they cannot yet see. A newspaper front page, prepared in the final hours before print, carried a single stark headline in heavy black type: "Brothers Divided." A broadcaster, speaking in the measured cadence of institutional gravity, framed the moment as the closing of a chapter that had been ajar for too long. One civilian, an elderly woman in a blue coat who had stood outside royal residences for more than half a century, was heard to say quietly that she had watched two boys grow up together, and that she had hoped, until this very morning, that they would grow old together too. Her voice broke on the last word. She did not repeat it. That mattered because in her small unofficial witness, an entire nation's private hope was given a single, trembling shape. The hope had not been for reconciliation as spectacle. It had been for reconciliation as ordinary human return. And ordinary human return on that afternoon had been quietly ruled impossible. Within the palace, the machinery continued its slow, precise work. A revised seating plan was drafted for an upcoming event. The empty chair reallocated without commentary. A photographer's schedule was amended. A press briefing was prepared, though it would never be issued in the form first written. Aides moved through corridors with folders pressed against their chests, their footsteps softened by the thick carpets that have muffled royal decisions for centuries. That mattered because, in royal households, silence is not the absence of communication. Silence is communication. Every removed card, every reallocated chair, every unissued statement carried a meaning as precise as a signature, and every one of those meanings pointed in the same direction. The door was closed. The door would remain closed. The door had, in truth, been closed for longer than anyone had been willing to admit. Harry, in the days that followed, did not attempt to reopen the channel. He understood at last the difference between a refusal and a verdict. A refusal can be revisited. A verdict cannot. He turned instead to the smaller, quieter work of building a life that did not require the palace's permission to exist. He walked with his children in the gardens of his own home. He read in the evenings from books that had once belonged to his mother. He wrote in a private journal sentences he did not intend anyone else to read. According to a documented private account, one of those sentences was a single line, written on a page otherwise blank. Some homes are places and some homes are people, and when the people go, the place becomes a museum. That mattered because, in that single line, Harry had finally named the thing that had been unnameable for years. He had not been exiled from a building. He had been exiled from a relationship. And no protocol, no folder, no revised communication channel could restore what had been quietly dismantled inside a small, pale gray office on the afternoon the door was closed. William, for his part, did not celebrate. He did not mark the moment. He did not permit himself the small comforts that ordinary men take after difficult decisions. He returned instead to his duties, to the diary he had not opened, to the ceaseless work of a future monarch preparing for a role he had never asked for and could not decline. He walked the corridors of the residence in the evenings, alone. And he paused sometimes in front of the drawer labeled "Pending." He did not open it. He did not need to. He knew what it contained. That mattered because in that small, repeated gesture, William revealed a truth that no briefing note could capture. He had not stopped loving his brother. He had simply stopped believing that love, on its own, could carry the weight of a crown. And the crown, in the end, is what he had been born to carry, whether or not the carrying broke him. Charles, watching from the distance that kingship imposes, understood the full architecture of what had happened. He had seen in his own lifetime how families become institutions, and how institutions become mausoleums, and how mausoleums, if not tended, become ruins. He had spent decades trying to prevent that arc from completing itself in his own household. He had failed in the particular way that all fathers eventually fail, by discovering that his sons had become men, and that men make their own decisions, and that a father, even a king, cannot legislate the interior life of his children. He wrote, In a private note preserved among his personal papers, a single line that would later be shared with only 2 people. He wrote that a crown can be inherited, but a brotherhood cannot be commanded. That mattered because in that single sentence, the reigning monarch had acknowledged the limit of his own power. And the limit of a king's power is the beginning of a family's grief. Catherine, in the days that followed, resumed the quiet, patient work of holding the household together. She attended to the children. She kept the schedules. She smiled in the appropriate places and spoke in the appropriate registers. But she also, in small moments no camera would ever record, placed her hand on William's shoulder as he passed her in a corridor, and let it rest there for a beat longer than politeness required. That mattered because in that small, wordless gesture, she was telling him what no aide, no briefing, no folder could tell him. She was telling him that he was not alone in the decision he had made, and that whatever the cost, she would carry a share of it beside him for as long as the crown required. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a public one. It was in the end the kind of gesture that keeps monarchies from collapsing under their own weight. The steady stabilizer, doing her steady, invisible work. The public reaction, when it arrived in full, was not what the tabloids had predicted. There were no riots of opinion, no eruptions of outrage. There was, instead, a strange quiet mourning that settled across the country like a slow fog. Commentators spoke in careful sentences. Editorials were shorter than usual. A morning broadcaster, closing a segment on the matter, said only that some family stories end not with a slammed door but with a door that is simply finally not opened again. She let the sentence hang. She did not fill the silence that followed. That mattered, because in that unfilled silence, the country understood what it was witnessing. It was not a scandal. It was not a feud. It was the end of a particular kind of hope. The hope that 2 brothers, raised in the strangest household in the world, might still find their way back to one another before time and title made the journey impossible. At the palace, as evening fell, the small pale gray office was locked. The folder was placed in a secure cabinet. The envelope, still unopened, was filed alongside it. The diary, still closed, was returned to a shelf where it would sit undisturbed for the remainder of the year. A single lamp was switched off. A single door was pulled shut, and in the corridor outside, a member of the household staff, walking her final round, paused for a moment in front of the closed door, as though listening for something. She heard nothing. She continued her round. That mattered because in that small, uneventful moment, the transition was complete. What had been only hours earlier, a living question between 2 brothers, had become, in the quiet language of the palace, a settled matter. And settled matters in royal households are not revisited. They are inherited. Harry, in his home across the ocean, sat that night on the edge of a bed he had made himself in a room he had chosen freely, and he thought for a long time about the boy in the photograph on the shelf. He thought about the older brother in the same photograph, and the son behind them, and the woman who had taken the picture, whose absence had, in many ways, written every chapter that followed. He thought about the closed door in the small pale gray office he could picture but had never seen. He thought about the folder he would never read. And he understood finally that the story of his return had ended not with a rejection but with a recognition. He had wanted to come home. He had discovered that home, as he had once known it, no longer existed. That mattered because in that recognition lay the beginning of a different kind of peace. The peace that comes not from restoration but from acceptance, not from reversal but from release. He turned off the light. He did not weep. He had wept, privately many times before. He simply sat in the dark and let the silence be what it was. William, in his own residence, sat at his desk long after the household had gone quiet. He opened the diary at last. He turned to a date several months in the future, a date that would have been his brother's birthday. He looked at the blank page. He did not write anything on it. He closed the diary. He placed it back on the desk. That mattered because in that single, unremarkable gesture, the future monarch had made a promise to himself that he would not share with anyone else. He had promised that even if the door remained closed, he would not forget the date. He would not forget the brother. He would not forget the boy in the matching coat, squinting into the English sun beside him. He would carry the memory the way a king carries a burden he cannot set down, quietly, precisely, and for as long as breath allowed. The door had closed. The love had not. It had simply been rerouted, through corridors no protocol could map, into a private chamber only he would ever visit. Charles gave the moment its formality. William gave it its architecture. Catherine gave it its grace. Harry gave it its honesty. And the crown, which had watched from every wall and every portrait and every silent corridor, gave it what the crown always gives in the end. It gave it permanence. What had been done could not be undone. What had been said could not be unsaid. What had been closed could not be reopened, not by pleas, not by anniversaries, not by the slow accumulated weight of shared childhoods. The door was shut. The folder was filed. The card was placed in the drawer labeled pending, where it would rest, undisturbed, alongside every other reconciliation the palace had chosen not to complete. And somewhere between the closed door and the unopened envelope, between the empty chair and the unwritten page, the story of two brothers found its final, unspoken shape. Not an ending, not a beginning. A silence held between them that would outlast every headline written about it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.